Day 601 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a quick look at those Russian losses again, as currently Russia sits on more than 289,000 military personnel losses, which represents an additional 800 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 14 tanks, 20 APVs, and a relatively whopping 26 artillery, which makes for an all-round fairly attritional day, once again, for the Russian forces. And to be fair, Ukraine loses some stuff as well. In fact, a verified 4,585 hardware losses. But here's the kicker for Russia. They're sitting on 20-odd thousand hardware losses, which roughly represents about 5 times the loss rate as Ukraine. But that's not even sufficient context, because the sheer disparity of the loss ratio between the two sides is likely to increase further in Ukraine's favour, due to Ukraine receiving newer hardware from international partners, hardware that is better maintained and all around more modernised, NATO quality hardware, and most importantly, better quality replacements that have a much lower attrition rate on the battlefield. Or, better put, a much higher survivability rate in comparison to their older Soviet counterparts. Meanwhile, the Russian army's situation is, well, effectively the opposite. There is no modernized NATO hardware for them, obviously, and instead what we're seeing is older and older, rusted out tanks, for instance, with no upgrades, no improved armor, and severely under-maintained, mechanically speaking, simply from just being left out in outdoor storage for literally decades. And since we're on the topic of figures, take a look at this graphic showing a record week of 428 pieces of equipment, Russian equipment, that's been lost. So almost half a thousand, which is actually made even more impressive by the fact of when you realize that these losses are only resulting from Ukrainian drones, and not from anything else. For instance, not from successful strikes by Ukrainian tanks, IFVs, ATGMs, HIMARS, Excalibur shells. I mean, the list goes on. Then we'll head across to the border today, as Ukraine's drones are still flying beyond the border and will continue to do so. This time into Belgorod, near the city, where the Russian Oblast's governor stated that 3 Ukrainian drones were shot down overnight. Little more is known at the present time. Then into Ukraine, starting out in the Poltava Oblast, as there was damage to residential infrastructure as a result of a missile strike into the oblast. And it's really such a rare location for Russia to strike out in such a small town, middle of nowhere, effectively. Which, perhaps more than not, speaks to the failure rate of Russian missiles through natural or mechanical causes. Then we'll head just south of Bakhmut into the Donbass today, as the Ukrainian army secured the last area close to Andrivka, located west of the railway. And at the same time, the Russian army continued retreating from the railway towards more easterly positions once again. And if you really zoom in here, you'll start to see where the lines are drawn, or officially where Ukraine has liberated up to, pretty much spot on to, well, west of the railway line. And of course, east is no longer completely controlled by Russia, but instead more of a grey zone. Then we'll head a little bit south to Avdiivka. So the amount of Russian scrap metal is piling up. Now, starting off, another attempt was made in the last day by the Russian army to break through the Ukrainian defensive lines on the northern flank. And Russia used several armoured vehicles and trashing them all in the process. We were even provided with at least one verifiable Russian tank turret toss. As such, Russian forces failed to maintain a lasting presence in Avdiivka's north, despite their initial advances in the earlier days of the assault. In fact, the Russian army was unable to establish control over the slag heap area, something that they had hoped for, and we may need to go to satellite to give you a better idea of this, so we'll zoom right in there, and there it is, the slag heap. And I might pop up a higher resolution image in the post-production. And so in this case, we're talking about the Terracon slag heap, which is a sort of a man-made mountain of waste material removed during the mining process, particularly associated with coal mining, with a coke plant or a coal plant not too far away. Now, with all of these Russian convoys getting destroyed by the Ukrainian forces near to Avdiivka, Putin himself reportedly called it, quote, active defense. Just after those recent Russian attacks where they got totally wiped out. And, well, I've always called Putin not a great military mind, but indeed he could be considered a good political mind, what with all of that consolidating of Russian political power over the last 20 years since becoming president in very late 1999, in fact. He was the prime minister just before that as well. And so, as part of this reported comment of Putin, it simply sounds like he's just trying to turn a negative into a positive, just like any politician worth their salt would do. Good on you, Put. But back to the Terracon slag heap for a moment. It's effectively a 30 to 50 meter high natural fortress, if you will, full of Ukrainian machine guns and artillery that Russian generals ordered their infantry to take without air support. And of course, they didn't end up taking it. It almost reminds me of that World War Z film, very appropriately named for right now, World War Z. Although in that instance, I think the zombies were successful in advancing over the tall wall structure instead. And with the atrocious performance in Avdiivka by the Russian forces, I did enjoy seeing some fresh Telegram updates like that of Russian propagandist Sladkov, who wrote a message basically preparing his audience for the lack of any actions by the Russian army in the coming months. So winter, for example, winter time. And I loved what he said, as he had a little bit of honesty, specifying so many things I have either reported on or postulated in the past. So take a look at this. He said, firstly, Russia's offensive potential needs to be 5 to 10 times as much to consider any real offensives, unlike that of the clusterfuck of a situation Russia found themselves in Avdiivka. And I literally, just the other day, said that Russia needs multiples upon multiples of more offensive brigades to encircle Avdiivka. He also went on to say that the Russian army needs, quote, discipline of reality of reports, which of course I've been harping on about, the sheer lack of reliability and accountability of written up and falsified Russian reports within the Russian army, which as I always say, it in turn creates a very inaccurate battlefield landscape or a lack of good intel for the Russian MOD, with these reports from the Russian army that go up the chain to the Russian MOD, making the army think they just have the edge in this war. But the information space is in many aspects erroneous for what the Russian MOD receives. And that's really the last thing that you'd want for your army. I mean, hey, if you're a Russian general, commander, officer in the Russian army and write up a report about the battlefield, you've generally got two options when writing it up. A, say it went well and get your bonuses or promotions or even just better fed. Bear in mind there is almost no accountability whatsoever for what you write on those reports. Or B, where you can alternatively report that your units got wiped out and you failed your mission, also that you failed to read the battlefield correctly, in turn causing you to get demoted and therefore usually get sent to frontline storm assault groups, where your days are truly numbered. So realistically, Russian officers prefer option A, and I do believe sometimes they even get a medal for bravery or heroism in the process. So not a tough choice for them at all. But back to what's been written here. So Sladkov also went on a bit of a small rant about having an equipment deficit for pretty much everything, including drones, thermal images, electronic warfare systems, and battlefield intelligence too, of course. And he also appeared a bit upset by the fact that the Russian army relies far too heavily on equipment from Russian civilians back in Russia or Russian businessmen. And he actually says that he hopes that the Russian military industrial complex should instead fill these gaps, as it rightly or probably should. But hey, suffice it to say, systemic change would be required for true change within the Russian military from the ground up. And that change won't ever happen, at least until, let's say, Putin leaves office, which could be a while. Then moving across, so somewhere in the east, a Russian Mi-8 helicopter was shot down by the Ukrainian 25th Airborne. Actually, this one occurred somewhere in the north, in the Luhansk region. Also, a Russian Uragan BM-27, which is a 220mm MLRS, or multiple launch rocket system, fired its rockets next to its hiding position. Then, so what happened was Uncle HIMARS came to town and made a surprise visit in counter-battery fire. And the results, of course, was just scorched earth and a deleted tree line as well. Which would certainly lead me to suspect that they were some relatively untrained Russian personnel in this situation. And Ukraine has actually been well reported from both sides now to have really incredibly effective or efficient counter-battery fire. They hone in on the position where the Russian artillerist, for instance, is located at, and then they proceed to take them out. But this information still doesn't seem to be received by the Russian frontliners. And it's a mistake. Shoot and scoop, buddy. Then moving across on the map to something we haven't really seen in a while or heard of. So there were explosions reported once again in Berdyansk, which is just by the sea line or the Sea of Azov. Now previously, earlier in this year, this turned out to be quite a well-known HQ position for various Russian commanders, generals. Then the AFU got wind of this information and did not let up on this location, until at least they felt that those types of threats were all but neutralized. Then moving a bit further west, as more explosions were reported in the Odessa region again. And so again, it appears to be the same old grain export strike locations, where Russia really needs to get their priorities straight on this one. Because it would appear that Putin and the Russian MOD have gotten so deeply entrenched in their previous decision to do whatever they can to attempt to militarily enforce their very own self-imposed situation. So they're feeling forced to take military action after they removed themselves from the grain deal a couple of months back. But only now they have to spend so much of their medium and long-range strike capabilities, missiles and drones, into this region, into the grain infrastructure, so that they attempt to show that their decisions are final. But in actuality, it doesn't make any difference to their position in the war whatsoever. So, in a sense, it very much comes down to Russian ego. But hey, when your enemy is making a mistake, well, you know the line. Then we'll head across to some news for today. We'll start out with a bit of hardware news. So, a member of the Armed Forces of Ukraine within the 104th Territorial Defence Brigade Battalion was delightfully reviewing his recently received Canadian-supplied Senator armoured vehicle. And I really enjoyed seeing the full footage, as he was really just so grateful and so full of joy, just talking about the vehicle, the one that he will be using. And why not, as it certainly beats the Buhanka Scooby-Doo tin can vans that are seen used all too often by the Russian side. And speaking of Russian hardware, well, a Ukrainian soldier captured a Russian Mosin Nagant rifle from a Russian trench. Now, these are a bolt-action, internal magazine-fed military rifle that was developed by the Imperial Russian Army in the late 1800s and was used by the armed forces of the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and now, of course, the 2022/2023 Army of the Russian Federation. You see, Russia don't stop. Instead, they just keep using older and older gear. Until they run out, of course. And I am flat out expecting that day to come sooner or later. Now, they won't run out of everything at the same time, but they will run out of one key component, followed by another, then another, leading to a pure domino effect of a collapse. But hey, I'm still open to the possibility of being surprised, as what they run out of could also be money from an economic collapse from a hyperinflated ruble currency, but only time will tell. Then in some other news, Putin arrived in Beijing today and will be holding bilateral talks with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping on the 18th, tomorrow. But Putin also visited China to time it with the Belt and Road Forum, held with various partner nations, including Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And Putin's visit would also appear to include the need to highlight the no-limits partnership between Russia and China amid the Ukraine war. Although, to add a bit of context to that, the no-limits partnership, as agreed by China and Russia, occurred back in 2021, before Russia decided to invade Ukraine. And I would certainly love to be a fly on the wall when Putin and Xi have a closed-door discussion. But I already roughly know what the officially released joint statement will look like from them. And it's very likely to be using quite diplomatic language that they can both agree on, which, for example, will state that something like Russia and China reaffirms that a number of strategic agreements were reached and that they have outlined a blueprint for continued economic cooperation between the two nations, something like that, and how they continue to strengthen their ongoing ties. Because that's basically the official statement published every time after the two meet for the last 18 months or so. But really, behind closed doors, conversation, I suspect, goes a little bit more something like this, where Xi is questioning Putin if the Russian army can sustain itself, and he'll ask Putin about the slow speed of the special military operation, and probably also ask Putin about any sort of time frame that Putin could really ever give about the ongoing SMO, as he calls it. She will also probably comment or stress the need to have China not overtly look as if they're helping Russia from an international perspective or standpoint. So Xi Jinping will be looking to ask Putin if he can weather this storm. Meanwhile, Putin will request ongoing raw material support so that Russia can at least build some of its own weaponry, as opposed to getting the final product direct from China, which is not really an option for China to do, at least not on any notable large scale anyway, due to risking any harsh international responses from the wider international community, sanctions and the like. But the two are not besties by any stretch of the imagination. They're more like convenient allies for now, as they probably both seek to disrupt the collective West's hegemony, but for their own separate reasons. Oh, and they will definitely speak about either China's or Russia's version of a peace proposal, a peace plan for the war in Ukraine. But as always, it's not likely to be one that flat out states that Putin's army should just leave Ukraine. Of course, I hope that I'm wrong with all of this, but it's just the way that these things go. Then in some other news, and not far away from China, and around the same time, so India's Chief of Defense, Staff General Anil Chauhan, when speaking on Russia said, quote, "The geopolitical importance of Russia will go down in the times to come, and it is in spite of it being a nuclear power. The Wagner rebellion indicates the internal weakness and the instability of Russia's future." So rhetoric like this isn't exactly towing the diplomatic line, as it relates to the supposed strength of the BRICS nations, for which China, Russia, and India are the three major partners in that potentially backstabbing partnership. Then in a bit of a lighter segment, so this is what a birthday at the front lines of Ukraine can sometimes look like. Sometimes there's cake and celebrations and candles, but sometimes, hey, there's some guys putting together some candy bars, etc., that sort of thing together, then surprising their fellow soldiers with them. Isn't that just sweet? Then as for a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys, so as part of Putin's visit to China at the moment, Putin was televised chatting with a Chinese media corporation, someone interviewing him from the country, and he doesn't exactly have the long table to protect him from all of those nasty germs that he probably perceives to be out there. But from this video, I would submit that he explicitly requested to be spaced far, far away from the interviewer, or anybody that's not a high-ranking figure within the country, like Xi Jinping himself, which you'll see tomorrow. But this is our bunker boy. He likes to keep things all that little bit separate. So thanks again for watching, guys. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit the like button, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.